Our discussions over these next 5 nights is to assess the issue of the rise of the far right and white supremacy, and how racism has once again come to the fore of not only our national dialogue, but also the international dialogue as well. And specifically to look at the reasons as to why racism has come forward again, and its particular targeting of Muslims across the West, and then to be able to chart out what are the specific solutions that Islam has to offer when it comes to the rise of the far right. Here, I'm not saying solutions just about racism. The far right is a global phenomenon that is not only part of a political spectrum, but also has its roots when it comes to certain religious movements. It has its role when it comes to government. It has its role when it comes to media as well. And so we know that the far right and fascism and populism and these various different terms have come and gone in the past in different ways, in different times. They have ebbed and flowed. But again, the ugly face of the far right movement has risen again. And in particular here for you and I in Britain or across the West, fascism and the far right has come again and risen once again to the effect that it has taken over part of even government understanding, government policy. It has affected the Muslims such that many Muslims are now even afraid to act their Islam in public. And so an Islamic solution needs to be able to focus on what the sources of the problems are and how Islam seeks to nurture a society and in individuals out of those practices of hatred, out of that practices of racism, which ultimately ends up becoming a manifestation of the far right movement. So this will be our discussion, inshallah, over these next 5 nights. And of course, we are also remembering Her Eminence, Lady Fatima al-Zahra, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayha. And we want to be able to link this discussion back to her and to be able to dedicate it to her so that we are able to take from her great movement and the times in which she lived in as well. For tonight, inshallah, I wish to be able to look at 3 things. The first is to question, why are we talking about this subject for 5 nights? Why should it be so important as to dedicate a series of lectures to the rise of the far right and the Islamic solutions that may be offered to it? Number 2, we want to ask, what will we be covering over these 5 nights so that we have an idea, and also when you go home and think about some of these particular things in advance, you and I can reflect at home about some of the issues that have been spoken about and are yet to come. And therefore, when you come in the following nights with your own thoughts, your own preparation to be able to discuss some of these issues as well. And lastly tonight, by way of introduction, we are going to challenge the theory of race itself. Is there such a thing as races? To which race do you believe that you belong to? What does science have to say about the theories of race? Where did these ideas come from? And ultimately, what does Islam and our texts say about the concept of race? Because if we're able to show the way in which race truly is, then it will remove much of the problems about racial profiling, racial existences, and ultimately the foundations of the ideologies of the far right. First things first tonight, inshallah. We want to ask, why are we studying this particular topic? And there are a number of reasons. The first reason is, it is obligatory for a Muslim to have awareness of what is taking place in the time in which he or she lives in. This is very well known. For example, the hadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, is narrated to have said, "Man asbaha," whoever wakes up in the morning, but does not have concern or care for the affairs of the Muslim ummah, he is not a Muslim. He should not consider himself to be a Muslim. Look at the strength of this hadith. Now, it doesn't mean that you fall out of the categories of Islam and I can state that you have become a kafir. It means that one of the responsibilities of the Muslim proper is to be aware of the challenges of their time, and that when they wake up, their concerns are for what is taking place around the world and locally to themselves. The fact that the Muslims are being so much challenged and there is so much hatred towards Islam, towards the Holy Prophet of Islam, so much misunderstanding, it necessitates our awareness of these particular issues. Within this concept, it goes even further. Not just that we are obligated to know what is going on. In fact, the one who properly understands the challenges of his time shall never be defeated by them. A hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, where he says, أَعْرَفُ النَّاسِ بِالزَّمَانِهِ مَنْ لَمْ يَتَعَجَّبْ مِنْ أَحْدَاثِهِ. The one who is most aware of the times in which he lives in, he shall not be surprised by the events therein. Here it doesn't just mean surprised, but defeated, overcome. A person who knows what is taking place in front of his eyes would not be surprised, would not be defeated when the events unfold the way in which he should have understood that they would have been unfolding. Imagine now, there might be amongst us people who were surprised with Brexit. But of course, if you look at the factors surrounding it, that you had, let's say, 10 years of austerity, let's say you had 10 years of increased security concerns around terrorism and other things, when a community of people is fearmongered so much, and then ask the question, do you wish to be able to stay within the status quo of the way in which policy and politics are made for you? Do you think that they will say yes, or do you think they will say no? The answer, of course, would be that many would be so frustrated that they will say no. Similarly, for example, the rise of Donald Trump or the far right in the United States of America. When you have, for example, Fox News and other outlets for decades talking to a nation and giving them the type of diatribe that they have been receiving for so long, it is again not surprising when someone comes forward and tries to gain the mantle on behalf of Fox News. We cannot be surprised by these events therein. Within this reasoning as well, the Muslim, especially the parent, and those who have younger siblings, younger nephews, younger nieces, they have an obligation as well to nurture their children in a way in which they are prepared for the specific events around their time, for the specific challenges of their time. The Holy Quran mentions this. In the opening verses of Surah Maryam, chapter number 19 of the Holy Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrates to us the story of Prophet Zakaria alayhi salam, Zakaria says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Inni khiftu, I fear that my own cousins are going to be the ones who take over after me. Inni khiftu mawaliya min wara'i. I fear that from my own family members, they will be the ones to take over after me. Why? Because Zakaria alayhi salam did not have a child. As an elderly man, still did not have a child after him. And so there would be no one from the lineage of prophethood to deal with the challenges immediately after his death. So one of the reasons why he wanted to raise a child was to be able to deploy him as a response to the challenges that would come from Banu Israel. We are in the same position. When we come here for our majalis period, we are here not only to come and listen and learn, but really to take away steps to reform ourselves, to reform our own societies, to be able to make a difference in the way in which people think, so that they are closer towards the realities and the beauties of Islam itself. So when we have our youth, when we have our children here, we are doing so and we are pushing them in the direction of, these are the specific challenges of our time. I want to raise a community, a child, a family that is going to respond to the challenges of our time, the same way Prophet Zakaria alayhi salam did so in his dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Prophet Yahya alayhi salam. Number one, Number two, a second reason as to why we need to speak about this issue of the far right is that Islam is supposed to have a solution. Islam as a proper system of living is supposed to offer the world a way in which to come out of their social ills. It's all well and good in saying we shouldn't have racism. It's all well and good in saying white supremacy exists, we'll leave it to the government to sort out. What happens when governmental policy is part of the problem for the rise of the far right? Who then do you go to? The reality is, as Muslims, in order for us to be able to give an evidence of the beauty of Islam, it doesn't just need to have theory. It needs to have a practical solution to the challenges that exist in whatever framework they exist within. If I ask, what are the steps that Islam would use to be able to confront the rise of fascism in 2019, it needs to be that we have an adequate response to that question. And not just say, well, Islam considers racism to be prohibited. Or some throwaway line like, well, Bilal was the first muazzin of Islam. And so when he came, it showed how great a Muslim he was and there was no prejudice in Islam. This is not sufficient. And the reason why it's not sufficient is because it's not sufficient as a social order, nor does it really nurture the human being or the society to come out of the practices that they have. Reality is that throughout the Quran and Ahadith, reforming ourselves and actually finding solutions to social ills is at the core of what a social Islam is supposed to look like. For example, the Quran mentions that the prophets would say, "In urid illa al-islah mastata'tu." The thing I want, all I want to be able to do is to the maximum of my potential is reformation. Is to be able to change a society. How does Islam then change a society that has become embedded with racism and hatred for Muslims in particular? What does the Muslim society need to do to be able to evolve the way in which a generation has been brought up to think by virtual practices of its own government, practices of its own media as well? In fact, it goes further than this. The whole mission statement of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, has been that to break the shackles that society has upon them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the role of the Prophet, وَيَدَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِسْرَهُمْ وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. That the Prophet is to lift the burdens of society, to break the shackles and those things that hold them back. If this is proper Islam, the question for you and I is, how does Islam afford and propose a solution to the rise of the far right today? A third reason is very important, and I want everybody to make note of this in their minds and their phones when they're reflecting these issues to non-Muslims especially. That the rise of the far right, it is not something that has not been present in human history before. In the period of World War II, the reason as to why this great war took place was by and large because of the breakdown in society between various ethnic groups and the rise of fascism, which was used as a means to be able to kill tens of millions of people. Hermann Göring, a great historian and thinker, has mentioned that the Second World War was known as the Great Racial War. How many people died in World War II? 80 million odd people. And by virtue of it being the Great Racial War, this was the reason why so many people were massacred across so much of the globe. All the way from the United States of America, to Russia, to Europe, all the way to Korea, all the way to Africa and India. 80 million people being slaughtered on the basis of a world war that was inaugurated through racial hatred. There is a very famous historian by the name of Niall Ferguson And now Ferguson, in his book, The War of the World, History's Age of Hatred, expounds upon this point about the World War II being the war of hatred, the war which is a great racial war. And he mentions the following. He says, 3 things seem necessary to explain the endemic violence that took place in the years of 1935 to 1939 to 1945. He says 3 things started this great racial war. The first thing was that there was ethnic conflict amongst peoples. The second was economic volatility. And the third were empires in decline. And when these 3 things come together at one time, this will foster so much hatred amongst peoples. Only an event like this colliding with these 3 circumstances could cause a world war of the extent in which it did. 3 things. Racial conflict, the economic collapses, and empires collapsing. When these 3 things come together, world wars are created, according to Niall Ferguson. He says the following. In regards to ethnic conflict, I mean major discontinuities in the social relations between certain ethnic groups, specifically the breakdown of far advanced processes of assimilation. People were expected to assimilate into their countries. When they didn't, when it broke down and there was so much racial profiling and hatred, this is what caused the Second World War. Now think about this question for our own selves. Ferguson says 3 things caused the Second World War. Racial conflicts, and the second was economic collapse, and the third was downfall of empires. Ask yourself this question. Do you see the increase of ethnic conflicts around the world today and racial hatreds? Yes. Do you see a problem with economic balance? You know, here, even in this country, there are millions of children who are unable to go to school and get themselves a meal. This is the state of the 7th richest country in the world. Or Britain collectively, the 7th richest in the world. And millions of its own children go daily hungry. And the third was the collapse of the empire. And you can see that today it's not only an empire in terms of specific borders, it's the thought processes of people that think that they have a right over others. And when the collapse of that kind of mindset takes place, then you will see the coming of world wars, according to one of the greatest historians that has ever lived. Now, look at the trends that are taking place. Why should we as Muslims be concerned about the rise of fascism and all of these 3 possibilities, these possible streams coming together at one time? I'm going to mention a few statistics. And the idea is not to scare you, but to show you the realities of what is taking place in front of our very eyes. It may be that we haven't joined the dots. What now Ferguson does for us is he joins the dots. He says when these 3 things take place, historically you will see that world wars come about. Have a look at some of these trends and some of these statistics that are taking place. In Germany, for example, the polling shows that more than 44% of Germans believe that Muslims should be banned from immigrating into Germany. 44%. Imagine now if I divided the room in half and I said almost half of you, just this half of the room, 44% of you believe that Muslims should not be permitted into this country. This is what is happening in Germany. It continues. 55% of Germans now feel, in a poll, that they are strangers in their own country. Imagine, just because people of a different skin tone, or a different language, or a different nationality have come into their country, more than half of Germans feel like they don't feel at home in their own country. This one is very worrying, especially for Germany.
almost 10%, 1 in every 10 of Germans, would prefer a dictatorship over a democracy. What was the last time we saw a dictatorship in Germany? Weimar Germany. 1 in 10 polled said they would still happily have a dictatorship in Germany. This is what's happening in Germany. What's happening in France? For the first time ever, far-right political groups, not center-right, far-right political groups, such as that from Marie Le Pen's group and others, are now at 30% of all polling together. 1 in 3 French citizen votes far-right. That's Germany, that's France. What's happening in Poland, for example? In Poland, recently they had a 100-year centenary. And as there were demonstrations, as there were celebrations in the street, there were certain marches taking place in Poland. Members of the Polish government were part of a march whereby the demonstrators had flags saying, "Blood and soil, Europe will be white once again." This is happening at the moment in Poland. What's happening in the United States of America and in Canada? Again, polling says, coming out of the FBI no less, that last year was the most number of hate crimes generally, and the most number of hate crimes against Muslims specifically since records have come, both in the United States of America and in Canada. The point I make is that if you see what Niall Ferguson stated, that one of the 3 trends that has to be in place is a breakdown between racial conflicts and economic collapse, the collapse of empires and the way people believe in their rights to be able to control other people. These are the sources of such major conflicts. If we don't talk about this issue, if we are unable to address the issue properly, then how are we able to respond to this challenge of our own time? It gets worse. In regards to our own situation, in fact, how this affects the Muslims has become even further. For example, in London in 2017, there has been the most number of hate crimes against Muslims in particular, up 40% from the year before. Muslims are being coerced into thinking that they should not practice their Islam out of fear of the far right and the demonization that comes to them from certain government policies, from certain lines that are being created in the media. I'll give you a couple of statistics for you to be able to think about what's happening here in the United Kingdom. Again, according to one polling, 31% of children in the United Kingdom, listen to this stat, 31% of children in the United Kingdom believe that Muslims are taking over England. I don't see it. I don't know if you see it. But if 1 in 3 children think that, it worries us as to what the next generation is going to be thinking about Muslims when they grow up. 37% of Brits would support a political party that would reduce the number of Muslims in the UK through policy. In the UK, as a result of racism, 76% of Muslim men are less likely to be employed than their white Christian counterparts. In fact, there is a study that was done in the United States of America by the Yaqeen Institute, in which stated that 1 in 3 Muslim children wanted to tell another child that they were Muslim. 2 in 3 Muslim children in the United States of America were scared to tell another child that they were Muslim. Does that not concern you? Does it not concern you and I? Should this not be at the top of our agenda? When our own Muslims are so scared of their own identity that 2 out of 3 children are unwilling to tell another classmate, "I am Muslim." Another statistic tells us that 1 in 2 Muslims
didn't know whether they could have their national identity exist alongside their Muslim identity. They're scared to be able to say whether they're British Muslim or not, because half of Muslims adults prefer not to say that they are Muslim unless necessary. Is this not worrying to us? Does the Muslim community not deserve to have a voice? Does it not need to be in a position where it's able to respond and confront these challenges directly? And so from the pulpit, there needs to be this discussion to be able to teach our own communities and others about how to be able to respond to these challenges. So, what are we going to be talking about in the coming nights? What are our focuses going to be on over this 5-part series? Number one, we're going to look at what are the arguments that the far right have. When a far right individual says that he believes something, what are their arguments and how do we respond to them? Specifically, is there such a thing as races? Do races exist? Do you come from the Indian race, the white race, the brown race, or not? What do they want? They want an ethno-state. What does that mean? They want a state which is primarily white only. And they will work towards policies that removes Muslims. How do we respond to this? We will also be talking about how discontent comes in a society. When a society breaks down and begins to blame each other, why does this come around? And how do we pose to stop this issue? We'll be talking about the differences between white supremacy, populism, and far right, so that we know what we're talking about when we speak about these different things. We will also talk about, should Muslims be apologetic? Should Muslims be looking to assimilate into the cultures or not? Where are our boundaries? What happened to previous communities that tried to assimilate? For example, what happened to the Jewish community in the mid-1930s and 40s when they tried to assimilate into European standards of thinking? We will also be looking at the examples of Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam as how they integrated societies. We will also be asking the question, what is Islam's view on immigration? Do we believe in immigration controls? Do we believe in freedoms of movement? What is the Islamic policy on these issues when we confront this problem of immigration today? And lastly, in our series, we will talk about specific ways to be able to defeat the rise of the far right that have come about in our sociological texts, and what Islam says is the solution to fascism in our own particular circumstance. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Tonight, we're going to start with the first question. Is there such a thing as race? What is the theory of race? I'm going to ask a simple question and think about it for yourselves. Which race do you belong to? Have you ever received one of those forms and then it asks you to tick which race you belong to? Shout out to me, what are the different boxes that you can tick? British, Pakistani, what else? Arab, Asian, other, mixture, Afro-Caribbean, white, British. All of these are the boxes you can tick. The question I pose to you is, what do you tick? Is there such a thing as race or not? Because it seems to me, if there's no such thing as races, then it's simple to be able to say that racism shouldn't exist. But the moment you and I divide each other into different races, I'm able to say, I belong to this, you don't belong to this. And because I think my race is inherently better than yours, therefore you are inherently inferior to my race. This is the first question we need to ask ourselves. Is there such a thing as the black race, as the white race, as the Arab race or not? The reality is race is an invention. Race is an invention. and it was invented in the 1600s in what we know today as the United States of America. It was invented across America and Europe as a means of dividing people into different categories so that certain laws could be put in place so that certain people could have and others were legally forbidden from having. The whole concept of race is invented. Nothing in the Quran tells us that there is races. Nothing in the Quran tells us that there's such a thing as the white race or the black race. Nothing in the ahadith tells us that there is such a thing as races. This is an invention by pseudoscience and is used to be able to proliferate certain ideas. The problem is that we as Muslims fall into these traps as well. And we end up taking on a world view, the way in which we perceive the structure of the world, not in accordance with Islam, not in accordance with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's vision for the world, but we end up taking a vision of the world that has been imposed upon me, and then I imbibe it and regurgitate it, thinking that this is the way in which the world actually is. What I wish to do tonight is to be able to show you who were the inventors of race, what their arguments were, why they created these things, and then to be able to ask, what does the Quran say about the differences amongst human beings? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create these differences? And to see the disparity between the way in which the creators of race have created this concept and the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes for you and I to be able to see this concept. I'm going to mention to you a number of different individuals who have had scientific theories over time and have created theories of race. And I want you to note them down, because when you sit with people and when you talk to people about the issue of race, you and I need to have these arguments to hand and to be able to prove to people that this is where race has come from. This is where racism has come from. You as an individual, white, black, whatever, you don't need to hold on to these theories. These were invented by people and you no longer need to hold on to them if they are not true. The first I'm going to mention to you is an individual by the name of Carolus Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus. The surname is spelled Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus was amongst the first to use science to justify the invention of race. What he did was create a hierarchy amongst all the biosphere. He said there are animals, there are plants, there are insects, there are fish, and so there's a hierarchy amongst all of these different things. He had a book by the name of Systema Naturae, published in 1758. 1758, in which he decided to create a concept of categories of Homo sapiens. He said the first type of group were the Americanas. After that were the Asianas. After that were the Afrikaners. And then there were the Europeans. So he divided people into these four categories. Now immediately you will see the problem with it. The obvious question is, well, why should people be divided into those four categories? Who said that there are only four categories of people? Who said there aren't 20 categories of people? Who said there aren't 2 categories of people? He took a geography, and based on the geography said people are divided into these 4 geographical areas. Expanding on Linnaeus was a German professor by the name of Johann Blumenbach. Johann Blumenbach in the 1800s wrote another classification by the way of titled On the Natural Variety of Mankind. The natural variety of mankind. He decided there weren't 4 categorizations of people, there are 5 categorizations of people. He stated the following: there is a Caucasian race, which is a white race. There's a Mongolian race, which is considered a yellow race. There is a Milian race, meaning the brown race. There's an Ethiopian race, meaning the black race. and there's an American race, meaning the red race. You know, when we end up saying things like Caucasians, where does this come from? It comes from this individual. He was the first to come up with this idea of there being a Caucasian human being. Before that, this never existed. And instead of there being 4 categories of race, he argues that there are 5 categories of race. Later on, in 1866, an individual by the name of Frederick Farrar wrote and gave a lecture called The Aptitude of Races. The Aptitude of Races. And he said, there are savages amongst human beings. The savages were whom? The Africans. There were some who had an exception. Chinese, he believed, were savages. But they had a great civilization in the past, so they were exceptions. They're not as savage as the Africans. And so then he divided people into savages and civilized peoples. He said the civilized peoples were European, Aryan, and Semitic peoples. And so now either you're a savage or you're a civilized human being. After this came social Darwinism, and then came others where they began to argue that there were multiple different orders of people. What is the point of this? The point of telling you this is that when it comes to race, all of this has been invented. Some people believe there were 4 races. Some people believe there were 5 races. Some people believe there were 2 races. So which one is correct? Which one is wrong? The initial problem here is that if I decide to divide you into 3, or to divide you into 10, or divide you into 2, I am making this subjectivity upon you. I have decided to say you are black and you are white. I have decided to say you are from this race and you are not from this race. If you can see here that race has entirely been invented, you would ask yourself, why was race invented? Race was invented for the purpose of saying, if we are white, we have certain laws for us. You are black, you have certain laws for you. This was called anti-miscegenation laws. That in the 17 and 1800s in the United States of America, they decided to say that only white could marry white, only black could marry black. And the only way I'm able to put these laws into place is if I first divide you into certain groupings. Once I've divided you, then I can say this wealth belongs to me, this role in government belongs to me, only I have access to certain resources, you don't have access to those things. All of this was an invention. None of this has been stated in the Quran. And as long as you and I continue to perpetuate these ideas, then we continue to perpetuate racism at its very core. The continuation of me saying that there exists these different races and you are from one race and I am from another means that I am perpetuating a system that was created for the purpose of putting a certain race up and other races down. Either I can upend and undermine that entire system, or I can continue to perpetuate that system. It's entirely down to you. Now, given that this was a scientific evolution, given that science itself was trying to create these races and say there are categories of people here and categories of people there, it firstly requires science to be able to defeat this, doesn't it? It requires scientists to be able to tell us that this has nothing to do with any of these ideas that exist in the reality. There is a science professor by the name Professor Philip Kitcher. Professor Philip Kitcher has stated in his review that we can divide races into as many numbers as we want. If we wanted, genetically speaking, we could actually say that there are 7, or there are 10, or there are 20, or there are 2. It just depends on how you decide you want to divide people genetically. It just depends on how you want to divide people geographically. The fact is that none of these things are actually prevalent within our DNA. We actually come from one entire human family. It is our decision as to where we divide people or not divide people. Now the Quran mentions this. And the Quran mentions in a number of ways that we are actually one united human community. And that the divisions that have come amongst time have been there for the purpose not of rivalries, but for the purposes of finding unity amongst ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran the word ummah on a number of occasions. 70% of the time in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the word ummah in the Quran, He uses it in the context of mankind at large. كَانَ النَّاسُ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا. Mankind were one community. But when came to them knowledges, they decided to differ amongst themselves. Our responsibility is not to keep up the divides, but to find ways of uniting amongst ourselves. Those racial ideas that said, blacks are of one kind, they're more violent, brown is of one kind, they're one way, white is superior, all of these things have been invented. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states within the Quran, I have allowed these various nuances, these various differences amongst you for the purpose of what? Unity and coming back to each other for the purpose of working with each other and not against each other. As you know, the famous verse, first and foremost, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'il. For what purpose? Lita'arafu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made you into different communities and tribes. Why? To get to know each other, number one. So your differences are not problematic. The differences in size, the difference in shape of nose, the difference in skin color. This is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not problematic. It's for the purpose of getting to know one another. Thereafter, there is a verse that is very important, and it's the verse that we started with in the Arabic khutbah. And I'm going to mention to you one key issue that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the differences amongst people and the way a Muslim is supposed to see this issue of race, this issue of differences amongst each other. Chapter number 5, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 48. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمُحَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the following. We have revealed to you the book in truth, confirming that which preceded it from the scriptures, has a criteria over it. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed, and do not follow the inclinations away from what has come to you from the truth. Follow what Allah has said, and do not follow the inclinations of other people. If other people want to create systems to rule you over you, if other people want to create systems in order to divide you, that's not for you to take. You don't need to take from the other systems. Follow what Allah has revealed to you, and do not follow their inclinations away from the truth. Now he says, to each of you has been prescribed a law and a method. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. To each of you was a sharia and a manhaj. To each of you was laws and a way in which you were supposed to live. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِي مَا آتَاكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, had He willed, had Allah desired, He could have returned you all back to being one community. Why didn't He? Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make all of you one community again? He did it because He wanted to test you with the things that He has given to you. If He has made you a certain type of community, if He has put you in a certain region, He has made you of a certain shade of skin color, all of these things are not rivals to one another. All of them have been given to you for the purpose of testing how you use those things. If one country has access to one resource and another country has access to another, Islamically, these are not supposed to be used in opposition of one another. Because one country has access to gold, One country has access to oil. One country has access to this. One has a greater military. All of these things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to you for the purpose of using for each other and not against each other. When you come from one part of the world and he comes from another, none of these things are permitted to be seen as rivalries. All of you are one human community. Our problem has been that we tend to see things through the lens, not of Islam, but we tend to see things through the lens of the way in which these things have been created for us. I'll give you a story and then a final hadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam. Musa alayhi salam is in the middle of the Red Sea. And as the waves come crashing around and begin to swallow up Fir'aun and the army of Fir'aun, there comes a moment, according to our ahadith, there comes a moment when Fir'aun looks towards Musa longingly, in an extent of a hand, as if to say, "Oh Musa, save me from this moment." Imagine the terror. You're about to be drowned. You've just seen your whole army be drowned. The waves are crashing around upon you. The water is going into your lungs. Fir'aun looks longingly for a moment of safety at the hand of Musa alayhi salam. Do you know what the hadith says? Musa alayhi salam turns his face away in disgust at Fir'aun. "I want nothing to do with you, Fir'aun. I will not save you at this moment." The hadith says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed into the heart of Musa at that moment, "O Musa, why did you turn away in disgust from Fir'aun?" He says, "Oh Allah, this is Fir'aun. He is the one who has claimed godhood against you. He is the one who said, 'Build this high bridge and I will come up and fight against the Lord of Musa.' Now you want me to save him? Now you want me to extend a hand to him and pull him out of the water that is drowning him and Fir'aun at this moment?" Listen to the response of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, "O Musa, the reason why you turned away in disgust from him was because he wasn't a creation of yours. Had you created him, you would have seen him the way I see him. And if Fir'aun had just called towards me and not you, I would have been the one to save him." Look at the difference between how we see people and how we see the world versus how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees people and the world. Even Fir'aun, if he had called out to me, I would have saved him. Our problem is that we take every other idea as our own idea other than Islam's ideas. We divide, we separate, we make him to be black, we make him to be white, and then we buy into the very supremacist model of living that was first created to put you into slavery in the first place. And then we complain later on that white slavery exists. In the last sermon of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, the Prophet stated, there is no difference between Arab and non-Arab. Arab is not superior to non-Arab. Non-Arab is not superior to Arab. Black is not superior to white. White is not superior to black, except he who has the most amount of taqwa, God consciousness in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah doesn't see black and white. The Prophet doesn't see black and white. Allah never divided you into a superior race and an inferior race. He never made one group of people to be essentially better than another people. It was only about he who has greater piety and justice within them as a soul. The more you and I buy into these ideas that race exists, the longer you and I will perpetuate the very ideas and foundations that white supremacy uses in order to be able to say that you are less than someone else. It requires us not to fall into that trap, but from tonight to be able to think about our way of an Islamic model of understanding this world. Insha'Allah, from tomorrow we will discuss the arguments for an ethno-state and against an ethno-state, for eugenics and against eugenics, and then insha'Allah we will start to talk about the way in which society becomes discontented and starts to blame one another for their problems within their society. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.